Hello everyone. This video is meant to review our first and upcoming assignment for this course, which is our case study. Please be sure to reference the syllabus, which will have the due date for this assignment specifically. The important thing that you need to know with this assignment is that the information for the assignment can be found in the course content tab of Blackboard. Here is my Blackboard page. Yours would look differently because I'm the instructor. My view is different. But if you click into the course content section of Blackboard, you will see the syllabus listed and everything that you need for part one of your assignment for your case study. So you can click here and get the case study guide, and you can click here to get the mental status exam. Again, the HU guide for assessment is here, is what you'll be using for part one, and your mental status examination you'll also be needing for part one, which is due before part two. Again, please make sure you reference Blackboard, which will provide you information on your due dates for this assignment. So what you will be uploading is a thorough, comprehensive biopsychosocial assessment and mental status exam by using the Howard University School of Social Work Guide for Case Assessment. Please familiarize yourself with this assessment guide, and also feel free to use it in your work or in your field placement agency as well. So you'll be identifying a client that you are currently working with or have worked in the past. It doesn't matter which client you use, just make sure that it is a client that you are familiar with so that you can complete the case assessment guide. You are then to write up the case assessment guide using all the topic areas listed here. So the brief description of the agency, date of interview. This can be an approximation if this was something that was done last year or before. And making sure these sections are covered: part one, part two, part three, part four, part five, part six, part seven. So you're completing all this information. So you're going to duplicate this guide on a Word document, and you're going to complete it. This is giving you practice and skills completing a comprehensive biopsychosocial assessment. Again, presenting problem, brief, referral sources and process, brief, living situation, relevant histories. And you are to comb over these subsections and complete as much as you can. Again, this is a very, very, very important part. In order to develop a diagnosis and a treatment plan for a client, you have to do a thorough assessment so that now you're going to analyze all the information gathered in the assessment to understand what is going on and use this evidence gathered from this data to hopefully come up with a diagnosis for your particular client. And so again, living situation, relevant histories needs to be listed here, and making sure that you review each of these sections and include as much of it as you can. Now, the great news about this case study guide is that it also lets you know if there's areas that's missing in your evaluation, and specifically in your assessment. And so if you're going through this case study guide and you know that there are areas or several areas that you can't complete, that's usually a clue that you didn't gather enough information. Again, we're talking about comprehensive biopsychosocial assessments. And if you have missing information in this, or you didn't gather as much information as you can, it will impact your diagnosis. It will not be correct. It'll be misdiagnosis. And we talked about this in our week 2 in ethical considerations and ethical practice. And competency level. This speaks to competence of social workers, social worker and practice. So again, all these areas are important, and you're going to use this to write up your case study. Relevant medical, psychiatric, education, social service history. Again, all these things are important. It helps you conceptualize all areas with your client. But it also lets you consider other things that may be going on that may not just live in the psychiatric world. That's why medical is covered here as well as psychiatric. Education and social services. This is important to learn a little bit about this because you want to get an idea of whether there may be some neurodevelopmental concerns with your particular client, and so education and how they're doing in education or how they learn, how they process information. As well as the sensory processing, but how do they understand? How do they learn? How do they comprehend? This information is also important when you're gathering data from your biopsychosocial assessment and using to write up in your case study. Again, assessment of client personality, development, social roles, and ecological systems. You want to make sure you have that heading as well, including with all these subheadings covered, okay? Here, please understand that when this guide was created, it was the DSM-4 was out. We're looking at DSM-5, okay? So again, the DSM-4 is listed here, but we're looking at the DSM-5. I don't know who has the hard copy of this particular guide, but I will see if I can figure out who that is so we can update the information to DSM-5 because that is the current statistical diagnostic and statistical manual that we're using only. So here where it says direct service and DSM-4, we're using DSM-5, please. Also, you'll see a PIE assessment, which is acronym for person and environment. Again, intervention and planning, goals of intervention, intervention strategy, technique to achieve goals, modalities of intervention here. I don't want you to focus too much here. However, the importance of this section is to take all this information, right? Your assessment information. And now you're starting to think of, okay, what are the interventions necessary given the problems that I was able to assess up here. So here you should, by the time you get to this section, which is section 8, you should have an idea now of what are the key areas or issues, problems that need to be targeted. And so now you want to start getting a conceptualization of what are some of the intervention planning here. And so again, I want you to complete this section. And then are the interventions focusing on the individual? Is it focusing on a group, family, community, resources, etc.? So again, I don't expect a very thorough intervention plan here, but I do want to get a sense of how you're conceptualizing the key areas and how is that influencing how you're looking at intervention planning. I want to also see here if you're targeting with the goals of intervention and the intervention strategies, the key areas listed here. Here, give a brief discussion of what termination and follow-up would look like, and it could look many ways in terms of when you feel that your goals or interventions have been met. You can talk about what termination will look like. How would you know these goals and interventions were met? How would you evaluate your practice to know that these intervention plans and goals were met right here? And that's part of your evaluation. And then again, what terminations will look like in any follow-up. Follow-up can be followed by you. It could be referral to another a specialist based on the other challenges or the issues presented that you found in the other sections that you gathered in the other sections of this guide. And again, you should have a good concept by the time you get here what intervention looks like. And the interventions and the plan that you put needs to directly align with the assessment areas that you uncovered above. And so if you're identifying any problem or areas, there should be an intervention plan to address it. Also be mindful when you're thinking about termination and follow-up, think about ethics, our ethical duties and standard of practice, and how does that play a role here? If you understand some of the problems or the challenges that the client is dealing with, how do those problems and challenges impact how you look at termination and follow-up? Because sometimes there are key things that are going on with our clients that require us to be very sensitive to how we approach termination and follow-up. Again, ethics and ethical dilemmas. Here is your opportunity to demonstrate what you've learned and wrote about in your discussion boards on ethics ethical or ethical dilemmas associated with the case or the client that you're working with. Maybe this is self-awareness of yourself as a clinician and a tool in the therapy assessment and intervention of this client. Professional use of self. Were there any social work values and ethics that come to play when you consider this client? What were some of the values and ethics that you needed to consider in your work with this client? And were there any ethics or ethical dilemmas that arise? And if so, what were they? And how were those ethical dilemmas resolved? And that's what this section considers. Again, this is our way to evaluate and reflectively understand how we are to engage with our clients and how we are our checks and balance to make sure that we are practicing in an ethically appropriate manner and being aware of any of the ethical dilemmas. Avenues for providing leadership for policies and services. You may find out in your gathering of information that there were some gaps in services, whether it's related to the service themselves or the policies that govern the services or how services are delivered. You may find out in your thorough case conceptualization that there may be some challenges with leadership and how leadership is governing practice and services with that given client. So here this is having you take more of a macro lens as well, and having an idea of what type of challenges or opportunities, strengths may be available for you with the client. So here you're understanding the problems and the issues that are presenting, and see if there's any alignment or consideration with the agency in terms of the policies. Is it limited in being able to support the client in what they need? Maybe it's professional. Maybe there's some implications to the field of social work and its ability to provide support or services to the client given the issues that arose. Or maybe it is your agency is the best place to serve the problems that presented, and our profession is too. And you can use this as an opportunity to discuss about that. Also, interdisciplinary community stakeholders. Also, this helps you think about more broadly whether you yourself as the social worker, the agency is equipped to meet the needs of the clients based on the data gathered from the biopsychosocial assessment. Here you can decide about partnerships and other type of services or support that is needed for the client. And again, advocacy and promotion of social justice. This is important. Availability of resources relative to social, economic, or environmental justice. Appropriate channels for actions, policy implications, and implication for social change. In these two areas, this doesn't have to be thorough. However, I do want you to consider this and have something written up in these areas. And when you think about advocacy and promotion of social justice, also think about the Black perspective. Think about Howard University's Black perspective and any implications here. Again, I would like to see some information listed here to see how you're thinking about these sections of the case study guide. And as you move forward through this document, it gives you more comprehensive information and guidance on what needs to be included in each of the sections. Similarly, this is the mental status examination. This is very important. Any provider providing care, therapy, or mental health support to clients is the understanding where they sit in a mental status exam. So this guide helps you consider every contact that you have and an evaluation of what a particular client's mental status is. So with this, I would like for you to think about a contact, maybe your most recent contact, if possible, with that particular client, and think about the areas that you will cover in a mental status exam. And think about appearance, which is one area you're covering, behavior or psychomotor activity, attitude toward interviewer, affect and mood, speech and thought, perceptual disturbances, orientation and consciousness, memory and intelligence, reliability, judgment, and insight. These are the 9 areas that you're going to go over. So I want you to now examine your contact you're in contact with that client, and what did you gather from your observations? What did you gather in your interactions in terms of these key 9 areas? And here it goes into depth of what you're looking at in terms of appearance. General appearance, physical characteristics, grooming, facial expressions, use of makeup, height, weight, nutritional status. Again, what are you observing in terms of their appearance? And here, behavior or psychomotor activity also goes through the dimensions in which you are to evaluate what you noticed or observed from your client here. Now, the important piece here is to make sure that you highlight these key areas in your case study. In your biopsychosocial assessment. I want to make sure that all these categories are represented, and there needs to be some mention in each of these dimensions here. There may be areas in this category that you cannot complete for different reasons, and if so, you need to put not assessed, and put some reason why it wasn't assessed, um, and be clear on that. I want you to do a thorough mental status exam. So I don't want to see a lot of these not assessed. If not, then I want you to think and reflect more about the interactions and do your best to fill this part out. Because this is big. This allows us to understand what the mental status is of the person at the time of your contact with them. And it's also meant to help you develop your skills of observations, and being able to observe in these key areas and note what it is that you're seeing and observing, as well as providing evidence. So again, when you're writing these areas up, again, it is not an opinion based. This is an observation. So be very rich and clear in the evidence that you see that speaks to appearance. So if grooming is an issue, you need to be very specific. What grooming issues did you see? Did you see dirt on the shirt? Did you see tears? Did you see did you see where the clothes were too tight, too big, oversized, or so forth. So be very clear what it is, the rich descriptions to demonstrate that what you're seeing is indeed valid and accurate. And so I want to also talk a little bit about some of the things that students ask at this point. There may be sections that you cannot answer, but there are key areas that you need to do your best. So how much of this needs to be complete? The answer is all of it. I need to see where each of these sections are reflected in your guide. And if there's areas that you cannot speak to or that you don't have enough information, this needs to be listed here. I still want to see the heading, and I still want to see some kind of discussion here about whether the information is not available or missing. But I also want to see, also include some kind of statement to where you would get that information from and how you would go about getting information. So not just putting not applicable or do not have this information, but where would you go to get this information from, and some kind of explanation on why the information isn't presented. I'm going to make the argument that the more of these sections that are not complete, your case study analysis, the more questionable it will become. That means the diagnosis that you reach and that you come up with will probably, you will run the risk or increase the chances of having misdiagnosis, because there are key areas. So when this is incomplete, your case study becomes incomplete. And so now the final conclusions are not as valid or reliable. So please be sure that you do that. Now, once you complete the case study guide in its entirety, which is your comprehensive biopsychosocial assessment and the mental status exam, you're going to submit that separately. I will review all the case study guides that are submitted. I will be looking for completeness. I'm looking for comprehensiveness. I'm looking at analysis, rich descriptions, identifications as well. If there are any guides that are submitted that I feel are lacking information, it will be returned to students to finish completing. And that will be considered resubmission. And I'll speak later about what a resubmit paper looks like. However, resubmissions don't get the same grade as the original for papers that are not resubmitted. But once a thorough biopsychosocial assessment is complete, now you're ready to write up your case study paper. And what you're going to do is, after you submit the case study guide, I want you to continue to study it, review it, look at all the information on it, analyze, reflect all the key areas and sections of that biopsychosocial assessment. And then once you've done that, you're ready to write up your case study. Okay. These are the key areas that you're covering: presentation of case information and intake information. This is the summary of your case study guide, okay, and mental status exam. Not the full case study guide because it's too much, and mental status exam, but the relevant, important clinical information that is gathered that's going to find its way into your case study conceptualization. Again, without revealing the diagnosis here, you're just presenting the case information and intake information. This is your evidence for the diagnosis here. So you're taking the information from the mental status exam, you're taking the information from the case study guide, the key information, and now you're building your case evidence for what's going on here. What is the presenting problem? Select a diagnosis now using the DSM-5 and justify your reason for selecting the diagnosis. So here I want you to list the DSM-5 diagnosis in its entirety as it is presented in the DSM-5, because here what you need to do is make sure that I'm trying to see your ability to understand the diagnosis and to comprehensively write out the diagnosis and the key symptoms and the key factors. By now, you should be looking at the diagnosis and the criteria for that diagnosis and making sure it aligns with the presenting case information. So you should be also presenting case information and intake information that provides the evidence for the symptoms and the criterion listed here in your diagnosis. Describe the type of additional information that will be necessary for making a valid diagnosis. That is any additional information from your case study guide that is not listed, that is not specifically listed here in the DSM-5, but this may be social situations or events, etc., observations perhaps, that will find its way here, okay? You can also elaborate here on your mental status exam to help support. Or other outliers or other types of information ascertained to back up your diagnosis. In this section now, you're going to then again talk a little bit about that section of the guide, your case study guide that talks about treatment and interventions, right? But we just don't want to look at current treatment. We want to look at some past and present treatments that you would consider. Risk and resilience assessment for both the onset and the course. What are some of the risks identified in your case study guide as it relates to the presentation of the problem? What are the risks for the client as it relates to the problem? And what are the risks for the client as it relates to concerns about symptomology criteria and progression of diagnosis or disorder? Again, want you to think about what are some of the historical and present day treatments for the disorder that you've identified. Also look at your client and talk about some of the things from your, again, case, what are some of the data that you gathered that speaks to risks? And what are some of the data that you gathered in your biopsychosocial assessment that may speak to resilience? Think about strengths that the client presents, things that you've learned about the client that may help them become resilient or serve as resiliency factors as it relates to the disorder and the presenting problem. Not necessary, but you can consider using tables. Some students are very visual, and so developing tables are helpful from them. This is not required, but if it helps you understand interventions and treatments. If it helps you to depict it graphically, you can do that. If you want to have a graph of treatment and interventions for the disorders, if you want to have a graph that represents risks and resilience, if you want to have a graph that talks about how that mental health disorder, the course of it and treatment of it, you can do that as well. Again, for some students and people in general, they're very visual, so it helps them to create graphs and charts, and you're welcome to do that. Strength-based assessment techniques, including exception finding, developing a future without the problem, and building motivation. As social workers, we're trained and oriented differently when we're thinking about mental health and working with clients. We are not pathology driven. We try to understand what are the problems with clients, but we also want to be strength based. So here you're being challenged to do a little bit more in understanding not just the resilience that are listed here, but of course it could be very aligned. But what are the strengths and what type of techniques of assessment or observation did you uncover, did you use to uncover the strengths that you're identifying? Also, think about doing additional readings, journal articles, and understanding how would we address the disorder and what would a future addressing this order or a future without this problem look like? How do we build motivation and hope for the client? Understanding strengths. So here I want you to think about the disorder, but not from a deficit standpoint or pathological standpoint. But what the strengths of that disorder or that client specifically is. And at least one of the videos that I provided, they were talking, was two young people talking about living their life with particular disorders, ADHD and autism. If you notice, they talked about some of the challenges, but they also talked about some of the strengths and some of the benefits of having the disorder. There are areas that they can be impaired and they're compromised, but there are also areas within that disorder that provides opportunity for them to be their best, or things about their disorder that they embrace as the uniqueness of themselves. And so I want you to think more from a non-pathological standpoint and focus more on strengths base of a disorder. And what are any of those components? And this is challenging because most times we're looking at disorders and mental health challenges and issues extremely from a negative standpoint. And here what we're trying to do, and again, it's hard and it's a different way of thinking, but how do you conceptualize this problem from a strengths-based perspective? What opportunities does it provide for the client? What opportunities does it provide for the therapist? And this is how we instill hope to clients, and this is how we help clients change their perspective and their perceptions of what their challenges are and turn them into something empowering and strength-based for them as well as for us as providers. And this section provides information on contemporary responses and evidence. This will serve as the base of your treatment plan based on the diagnosis, risk resilience assessment, and treatment. And so here, think about contemporary responses to treatment. So here we're looking at, you're talking about some historical treatment and interventions for the client based on the disorder, right? And here you're really talking about those current and contemporary treatments and responses, but here providing more evidence demonstrating that this is the gold standard or standard of practice in dealing with this particular disorder. And here you want to write it up and provide some evidence, utilize the literature in order to do that as well. And in this section, as any good diagnosing therapist, you're going to critique your diagnosis. What if you got it wrong? What are some of the factors that may indicate that another diagnosis may be more accurate than the one that you provided? And this is a way of you doing your checks and balances and your due diligence. This is to say, hey, I gave this disorder, I gave this diagnosis. However, I do realize there were some symptoms, characteristics, and there were some things going on here that also made me feel that this disorder may also be present. However, I ruled the second diagnosis out because, And when you have that conversation, think about the case study guide. Was there enough information in that case study guide, or what information was missing from the case study that could not support that second diagnosis or third diagnosis? I'm sorry, yeah, second or third diagnosis. Also, think about the DSM-5. What are the criteria for that second diagnosis? And were you able to meet all of the symptoms and or not? And is that why you didn't consider that second diagnosis? Maybe it's intensity and frequency. Maybe they had the symptoms, but they weren't as intense, they weren't as frequent to justify. So here you're going to come up with another possible diagnosis and provide evidence why you ruled it out. And that evidence I'm looking for is, again, referencing your information that you gathered from the biopsychosocial assessment and the DSM-5 as well. As with all your other papers, you are making sure that you are consulting with the literature and making sure your write-ups are grounded in the literature. So provide a minimum of 15 references, 10 of which must be from peer-reviewed journals. Please feel free to utilize your textbooks as part of those references, but also consult with the literature. You are free to use the articles that are uploaded in Blackboard, but you're also strongly encouraged to seek some additional information to discuss your topic. And also just be mindful of the feedback that you're getting in the discussion boards, because not only do you have to provide these 15 references, but please be mindful as you're writing up the case study, you are supposed to be writing it up in APA format. And so making sure your citations and your references match in its appropriate APA format. In this place, make sure that you review the feedback and you correct any APA challenges or difficulties or errors that you're making on your discussion boards. The reason why you're listing APA format in your discussion boards is to correct any errors before we get to your major paper. So please make sure that if you have any APA errors in your discussion boards, that you correct them before you write up this paper, because more points are deducted from the paper for APA. And also discuss the implications for special populations. And here, I want you to do a thorough understanding of the disorder that you're presenting, and also talk about, are there any special populations that are progressively more affected with that disorder. So if it's depression, I want to hear statistics on what groups of people, what type of people are more at risk for that disorder. So here, again, think about the disorder and do some research on the specific disorder that you've identified and diagnosed, and talk about special implications or special populations in regard to that disorder. This can be about prevalence, this can be about severity, this can be risk factors for the disorder, prevalence of the disorder, whatever information that you can provide that really demonstrates that you understand not just the disorder as it relates to the client in the case study, but now talk a little bit about how this disorder affects certain populations or certain groups. This may also be a justification for why it's most likely affecting your client, if your client fits into that special population or implication group as well. Also, again, be mindful of the page length and the due date, similar to your discussion boards. Students must meet the expectations in terms of the length of the page, just the same as you are responsible for the word count of the discussion boards. Papers that do not meet the page limit, they must fall between 8 to 10 pages. If it says under 8 pages, it will be returned to students for resubmission. If it's over 10 pages, it will be sent back to students for resubmission. And this is 8 to 10 pages of content minus the reference sections. I do not count the references in the page number. So 8 to 10 pages of content. And as with everything else, make sure that you log these due dates, because there are no late papers accepted for this course. It is important that you meet the deadline for this course and start this project earlier. It's comprehensive. It has multiple parts. So it is very important that you get started on this case study assignment and all your assignments as early as possible. Also, please feel free to drop in to virtual office as you're starting to look at this assignment, as you're starting to write up the assignment, and then bring your questions, because I'll be available to answer any questions that you have with this assignment. Thank you.